Hello, I'm Angie Hobbs and I'm the Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy at Sheffield University. And today I'm going to give a series of talks about Plato's Apology, in which the character of Socrates gives the defence speech at his famous trial in 399 BC in Athens. But first we need to set the scene. We need to look at what's been going on in Athens at the end of the 5th century, in the years leading up to Socrates' trial. Why was Athens in such a nervy state? Why did it put a philosopher on trial? So I think the first thing to mention is the very long, brutal civil war between Athens and Sparta that had taken place in the final third of the 5th century BC, and in which Athens finally lost horribly. So there's been great poverty, there's been famine, there's been plague, and finally there's humiliation. As part of that conflict, Sparta set up an oligarchy of 30 tyrants who ruled Athens very brutally. And anybody who was associated with this tyranny in any way whatsoever was later vilified by the Athenians. Now, by 399, the 30 tyrants have gone. Democracy has been restored, but it's a very fragile, nervy democracy. Athens is not at ease with itself. There isn't the same tolerance of freedom of expression that there had been before the brutal war with Sparta and before the tyranny of the 30 oligarchs. Now, in this febrile climate, we've got Socrates. For many decades, he's been walking around Athens barefoot, accosting people, famous, not so famous people, and interrogating them, cross-examining them on their life, on their beliefs, on what they think certain virtues are. What is justice? What is courage? So he'll ask a general what he thinks courage is. He'll ask a politician what he thinks justice is. And by the series of questions and answers, he will try to get people to understand that they don't know what they thought they knew. They're not the wise experts they thought they were, that their views contradict each other, that there are holes in their beliefs. And of course, he makes many enemies in the process, particularly as he does this in public, and he can humiliate often very grand political figures in these public places. But he was, as I said, and he was tolerated for many decades, but now in 400 things are getting much more difficult for him. The numbers of his enemies are rising. Amongst his associates have been many young men who've hung on his every word, and some of these young men have gone on to be associated with the oligarchical tyranny, the 30 tyrants. So though Socrates himself, there's no evidence that he was particularly interested in politics in this way, there's no evidence that Socrates himself particularly had oligarchic sympathies, though he's not particularly democratic either, but he's associated with people who now have a bad name. There's also Aristophanes, the comic playwright. Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, absolutely lampoons Socrates. And it lampoons him in quite an interesting way, because it says on the one hand, he's a useless natural philosopher. He studies the things in the air, the things beneath the ground, all these sort of useless things in the heavens and under the earth, in the way that people like Anaxagoras or Thales had been doing. The philosophers we now call pre-Socratic. Of course, they weren't called that then. But also Aristophanes ridicules Socrates for being a sophist. Now, the Sophists were itinerant teachers of rhetoric, of political theory, of philosophy. They walked around the Greek world from city to city. They charged young men very high sums of money, or more likely the fathers of young men, very high sums of money, to learn the skills that would enable them to speak in the assembly, to speak in the law courts, to make a name for themselves in public life. And they got very rich in the process. And they taught these young men how to win at arguments. And the less scrupulous sophists taught young men how to make even the weaker argument appear the stronger argument in practice, and therefore got sophistry a bad name. The older generation were very shocked. They thought this was a very immoral practice. They were very worried about what was being done to the minds of these young men. So if Aristophanes, the comic playwright, portrays Socrates as a sophist, then that's going to give Socrates a really bad name in the minds of the multitude, the people who don't study philosophy, who are not particularly interested in philosophy but are just very worried about corrupting influences on the young. So all this cauldron has been building up, this boiling cauldron. Socrates is making more and more enemies. There are more and more slanders being made about him. And this is in a political atmosphere where anybody with any associations to the oligarchic regime of the 30 Tyrants is seen to be suspect. Anybody who asks any questions at all about the value of democracy is seen to be suspect. And it's in this climate that Socrates' three official accusers, Anytus speaking on behalf of the politicians, Meletus speaking on behalf of the poets, and Lycaon speaking on behalf of the orators, accuse him and say that he is corrupting the young, that he does not believe in the city's gods, and that he's introducing new, they're called daimonic figures, we'll say more about that in a later section, new daimonic beings into Athens, that he worships not the traditional gods but these strange daimonic creatures instead. That's the climate.